given a choice to follow God or to do what is wise in their own eyes. To follow God is to experience blessing and flourishing as he created humanity for. But at the same time, why does it seem like those who aren't in a relationship with God, that those who do what is wise in their own eyes, who follow their own kind of selfish ambition and whatnot, that those are the people that seem to prosper? And that following God just seems really, really difficult and hard. You guys are old enough to have seen people get away with doing the wrong thing. I'm sure you guys have it at some point in your lives. Right? We see in the story of Scripture even people sometimes prosper despite doing evil, at least initially. Right? Even Psalm 73 will ask this question, why is it do the wicked prosper? In his epistle, Peter frequently identifies the church as strangers, aliens, foreigners, and exiles in this world. The thing about strangers, aliens, foreigners, and exiles is that they often lack the rights that citizens have. See, when you're a citizen, you're seen as a member of society. You have rights. You are entitled to certain privileges. But as a stranger, alien, foreigner, and exile, you're seen as something that is other. You're seen as something that doesn't really belong. And so while this suffering church has outsider status and lacks rights, lacks power, lacks privilege, and they are true outsiders at this time that Peter is writing this letter to this church comprised of strangers, aliens, foreigners, and exiles. In God's eyes, they are his holy nation and people. And as his holy nation, they are called to holy conduct. In God's eyes, they are his chosen people, chosen as instruments for his kingdom. So just as Peter has used the language of foreigner and exiles, in this next section that we're entering into, Peter's going to outline the different relational dynamics for how Christians should conduct themselves in the midst of a world that really just frankly does not care for them at all. That's even antagonistic towards them. So the first relationship that he will point out is that between slaves and masters. In previous eras, this passage was ripped out of its context and used to justify slavery. That people would look at verse 18 and say, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. And they would take that out of context and immediately just say, see, this is the Bible advocating or justifying slavery. And that's really completely missing the point at what Peter is getting at. First off, when Peter writes this section, he doesn't address the masters, he addresses the slaves. He addresses them directly. The slaves are the ones who are the members of his church and his flock and his congregation. And secondly, what Peter is really trying to do is he's identifying a common practice in this broken world and using it to point to Christ. The churches in this time period had people from all walks of life, and so he's using their current context to demonstrate Christ's own suffering. And so in this passage, he's identifying the masters as the ones who are persecutors of the church, and the slaves are the ones whose plight resembles that of the suffering church. We see here when Peter writes to the slaves, when he's telling them to show respect to their masters, it's for a greater purpose. We see in verse 20, for what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But when you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in turn. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. See, Peter is elevating the identity of the slaves by pointing out how Christ identifies with their suffering as well. He's affirming that, slaves, you have suffered unjustly. You have suffered and been beaten even despite your own righteousness, but despite your own conduct. And he points them to one who understands what it means to suffer unjustly, to suffer in spite of righteous living and holy conduct. See, Christ doesn't identify with all of our successes. He doesn't identify with our good GPAs. He doesn't identify with us having a cool group of friends. He doesn't identify with athletic success or what kind of college we get into. He chooses to identify with our weakness. And the reason for this is that we have nothing in our life that can measure up to the greatness of Christ. There is nothing that we can succeed or achieve in this life that measures up to Christ and his relationship with the Father and being fully God, fully man, being perfect humanity, living as perfect humanity in his 30 years on this earth, right? If we tried to, all of our goodness would always fall short. No, Christ steps into our lives. He steps into our brokenness and he lives a human life. He lives a human life with all of its difficulty. And he shows us how we can live as God's holy people. The next relational dynamic that Peter then hits on is between wives and husbands. Now, before we talk about that, I want to kind of share a little story, just a little anecdote about my dad. My dad went to UCLA, and so growing up, my brothers and I, we were all just huge UCLA fans. So in the fall, every Saturday, we're watching college football. And then from like the fall to through March, we're watching college basketball 2 times a week. John Wooden, the legendary basketball coach at UCLA, was required reading in my family. And I don't mean that like exaggerated, like literally it was required reading. My dad made us read John Wooden's autobiography, They Call Me Coach, and he had us do book reports on them. And not like book reports for school, like he had us do book reports for him, right? But there's this really great John Wooden quote that, I've just kind of had burned into my brain over the years. And it's this. It says, "Be more concerned with your character than your reputation. Character is who you really are. Reputation is what people say you are." We live in a society that cares deeply for our reputation. And this isn't just like a new thing for students your age. Like I remember this for myself growing up. Right? I remember growing up amongst my friends, and it always felt like our parents, even though we were friends, our parents were kind of like comparing us to one another, right? It's like, oh, like my child is taking this amount of AP classes. My child has these extracurricular activities. My child is getting into these UCs and IVs, right? And then but not even just amongst parents, but even amongst like friends ourselves, right? Even on social media, there are times where it's so easy to look at what other people are doing and feel like we're just lacking somehow. So then we have this anxiety, like, oh, maybe I need to like create and post something so that people can be aware that I'm here and I'm doing something right now. That's why this next command that Peter gives when he's highlighting the relationship between wives and husbands is so important. And it's to let your character show. We see here in chapter 3, starting in verse 1, Peter says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, putting on gold jewelry, or clothing wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the immeasurable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." Now, here Peter is addressing wives whose husbands are probably not Christians at this time. And he's not saying this to say like, hey, it's okay for you guys to just marry whoever. It's okay to marry people who have different religious values and beliefs than you. That's really just not the wisest thing. But if you think about it at this time, Christianity is still a relatively new religion. So as you're seeing new adult converts come to know faith, come to Christ, it's very possible that they are the first Christian in their family. And that other members of their family are kind of wondering, like, why are you following this new religion, this new faith called Christianity? Why are you following this guy, Jesus? Right? And so Peter's command for the people here is this, is to let your character show. That the most winsome thing you can do is not with words, is not by berating, is not by just browbeating, right? It's through your character and your conduct. Because if your character and conduct shine through, then there's nothing that anyone else can really say that can change that. I remember I had a pastor when I was living in Chicago. He had this one quote that one of the least impressive things is to know a lot about God, but to live a life that doesn't show it. Right? One of the least impressive things is to know a lot about God, but to live a life that doesn't show it. And I remember that really hit home for me because, I was in school for ministry, right? I wanted to be this person who knew his Bible really well, who knew theology really well, who could win arguments, right? I took kind of like some pride in that over like, hey, I know my theological opinion and I know that it's correct, and let me tell you why. And so when he said that, right, that the least impressive thing in the world is to know a lot about God and to not show a change of life, it completely flipped my world upside down. Because for so much of my life, I just enjoy being right. I'm kind of a verbal person, so I want to justify and prove myself through my words. But more important than my words, more important than my accolades, more important than my achievements is my character. It's who I am. This conduct for holy living we've talked about isn't just for the sake of like being holy. Yes, it's to glorify God. But it's also for the Christians at this time to be good neighbors. And for God, being a good neighbor isn't having better achievements than those around you. Being a good neighbor isn't having better grades than those around you. Being a good neighbor isn't like just having a bunch of friends. Being a good neighbor is showing the depth of your character. And if your character reveals Christ, then you have strong character. There are times where being a Christian is difficult. That's just a reality. Where it's not the easiest thing to do, where it's not going to look good on your transcripts, and it's not going to be something that we're applauded for. But it's in those moments that we remember that Christ understands what it means to experience difficulty, what it means to experience hardship. And he's given us a model for our character. Let's close in prayer. Father God, I thank you for the fact that your word isn't just a change in status. Lord, it's not just a change in what we call ourselves, Lord, but it's a change in our entire lives. It's a change in how we live and interact with one another. And so I pray in this really difficult season, Lord, for so many of us, that we would show